Welcome everyone to the very first RISM lecture. We're very pleased that over 300 people from around the world have shown their interest, and we're very happy that you're here. Before I hand it over to the speakers, I would just like to go over a few points of housekeeping with you. First, please note that the speakers will be recorded. The talks will be posted to RISM's YouTube channel. Also, please keep your microphone and video turned off. You can use the chat function to ask questions at any time. We'll have a short question and answer session after Thomas Schmidt's talk, as well as after Richard Sherr's talk at the end. If you're on social media, use the hashtag RISM Lecture to share your impressions with us. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Klaus Pietschmann, who is the president of the RISM Board of Directors.
Thank you, Jennifer. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of RISM, it is a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the entire Board of Directors to this first RISM lecture. When the idea for such an event first came up almost 2 years ago, nobody thought of a corona pandemic. Our idea was to get together in a lecture hall, perhaps with 40 or 50 guests, and record the event for our YouTube channel. The fact that we now have a total of about 230 people sitting together before their screens would have been beyond our wildest imagination. We all suffer from the current situation, and especially for us, for whom music is a central purpose in life. The current impossibility of shared musical experiences is hard to bear. But the many online concerts, conferences, lectures, and this virtual RISM lecture show that the current crisis has also revealed possible solutions that point to new paths for the future. So we hope to continue these lectures in a loose sequence and thus to create an opportunity to talk with you, dear colleagues and friends, about the topic that connects us all, about the sources of music, their preservation, description and cataloging, but also their scientific evaluation. The occasion for this first RISM lecture is a great achievement of the last months. The choir books of the Fondo Cappella Sistina, one of the most important sources for Renaissance and early modern music, have been described in the RISM database and are available in the general RISM catalog as well as through a special search interface. It should be underlined that these represent the first scholarly description of many of these manuscripts. I'm very grateful that the director of the Department of Manuscripts and Scriptor Latinus of the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, Dottoressa Claudia Montuschi, will immediately speak a few words of welcome. It was by no means easy to transfer these descriptions into the RISM database. And here I would like to express my warmest gratitude to the colleagues of the RISM Editorial Center, who did an excellent job in this regard. The head of the RISM Editorial Center, Dr. Balázs Mikusi, will say a few words about the RISM database. All this was made possible, however, only thanks to the cooperation with Professor Thomas Schmidt, who dealt intensively with the manuscripts about 20 years ago and generously made his descriptions available to us. In his introduction, he will report on the history of his research and present his descriptions. For the first RISM lecture, we couldn't have had a more suitable guest. Professor Richard Sherr is the leading expert on the history of the Papal Chapel and one of the most distinguished scholars of these manuscripts. In his talk, Reflections on 40 Years with the Fondo Cappella Sistina, which in fact was changed a bit and I will say it afterwards, he will share with us insights into his long involvement with the collection. At this point, however, allow me to say a few words about the importance of this achievement for RISM. In fact, the cataloging of the Vatican choir books signifies a return to an essential concern of the founders of RISM. The Répertoire International des Sources Musicales was founded as a joint effort of the International Musicological Society and the International Association of Music Libraries in 1952. From the very beginning, RISM showed a strong interest in Renaissance music. The series A1 and B1 documents printed music of the 16th century, and other volumes of the series B describe manuscripts of polyphonic music, tablatures, and hymns. Especially important were the volumes on Handschriften mit mehrstimmiger Musik des 14., 15. und 16. Jahrhunderts, edited by Kurt von Fischer together with Max Lütolf in 1972. They were dedicated to the Trecento repertoire and the organum-like music sources of the 15th and 16th centuries. Nanny Bridgman's catalogue of 15th and 16th century Italian music manuscript was conceived as a further step in this direction, but afterwards these efforts came largely to an end for various reasons. The main reason for this was the agreement according to which the support of RISM Association was taken over in 1980 by the Academy of Sciences in Mainz. Since then, RISM's official main task has been the cataloging of music manuscripts between 1600 and 1800. Of course, this never forbade us to engage also in other fields, especially when international working groups offered data of a different character, but in accordance with RISM's general mission to catalog sources of music. But the main focus has inevitably become the early modern period after 1600. In recent years, RISM has sought to build on its old pre-1600 expertise. Volume B1, containing printed collections of the 16th and 17th centuries, was edited by François Lesure in 1960 and became the only authoritative RISM catalog in the context of RISM Renaissance music research. Its numbering, introduced by the chronological list of the collections, is still in common use. It was Howard Mayer Brown who took over the task to revise the entries in this volume for the first half of the 16th century, and when he died in 1993, he left a well-advanced but not finalized manuscript of his revised B1 catalog. It turned out to be a problematic heritage, which on the one hand was another testimony of Howard Mayer Brown's astonishing scholarship that contained extremely valuable information, but on the other hand, it wasn't ready for publication as a book. The solution came about only a few years ago, when RISM's cataloging software Muscat became advanced enough to include also these printed collections. With additional financial support, it became possible to integrate Mayer Brown's data into Muscat and to consolidate these records. The same was done for Gertraud Haberkamp's unfinished continuation of this revision project dedicated to the second half of the 16th century. By consequence, the RISM online catalog today offers efficient search strategies for printed collections of the 16th century. Now, the Cappella Sistina choir books mark the second major step in this direction, and we intend to continue along this path. Future plans include, for example, close cooperation between RISM and DIAM, currently the leading database for music manuscripts before 1600. Before we now move on, I would like to thank all those involved in this project for their great cooperation. Thomas Schmidt for providing the catalog records. The Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana and its prefect, Don Cesare Pasini, for his great openness and support of this project. and the team of the RISM Editorial Center for the excellent technical implementation. Special thanks to Richard Sherr for his willingness to take on this first RISM lecture. I now wish all of you a stimulating evening, or hours wherever in the world you follow us. The fact that you have joined us from so many parts of the world is an impressive proof of the global importance of RISM. And together with my colleagues on the board, we take this as an incentive for our efforts to continue to develop this unique project. Thank you for your interest and support for our common cause.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to hand it over to Claudia Montuschi, the Director of the Manuscript Department of the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana.
Good evening. Okay, thank you. Mr. President, Director, Professors, and friends. I am pleased to extend a greeting on behalf of the Vatican Library to introduce this lecture dedicated to the Fondo or collection of the Cappella Sistina, which is of fundamental importance for the history of music. The Archivio dei Musici Cantori della Cappella Pontificia consists in a set of 3 sub-collections that take their titles from the Cappella Sistina: Cappella Sistina Manuscritti, Cappella Sistina Camerlengato, and Cappella Sistina Diari. Manuscripts, as well as printed and archival material together. They arrived at the Vatican Library on December 12th in 1870, but only later did they become part of the library's collections. The uniqueness and preciousness of these volumes for the history of music and beyond have now become evident after the work of cataloging and numerous studies carried out to date. The leading experts of the field are with us here. From the very beginning at the library, there was an awareness that the Cappella Sistina contained a rich and important heritage that ought to be studied. Franz Xaver Haber was the first to compile the catalogue in 1888. In the introduction, he recalls the moment when he was granted access to the collections of the Cappella Sistina, previously unavailable for consultation. This was not a personal favor, but a decision made by Leo XIII to make these collections, as well as the rest of the library's collections, available to all scholars, and to set off a new upsurge in the work of inventorying and cataloging. This initiative was fully part of the work of a pope known for several other openings, starting with the rooms of the library in use for readers today and Vatican archives, for having initiated lasting developments and for having regarded the library as a perennial monument of culture and civilization. Haber also tells us about the local arrangement for the volumes of the Cappella Sistina on that occasion. A large, bright room that overlooked the Cortile della Pigna on one side and the gardens on the other. New cabinets were built for the purpose. The need to provide a research tool for immediate use and the idea of extending the inventory to other musical manuscripts came from Giuseppe Baronci, the librarian of the Chigiana, then active in the Vatican, who wrote, "The inventory of these manuscripts had already been done with great care by Mr. Haber, but experience has shown that scholars often waste time trying to understand them and they cannot find what they want quickly." In the 30s and 40s of the 20th century, he prepared an inventory of the musical manuscripts contained in the various Vatican collections. The catalogers, starting with Haber, did not fail to see that the volumes were in a critical state of conservation due to the corrosive effect of iron gall ink and to restoration treatments carried out in the 18th century, which involved excessive trimming along the margins of certain quires and dislocated folios. José María Llorens, 1960, also took note of the same. So too Lawrence Feininger, who had been working with the music collections in the Vatican Library since March 1946, referred to the restoration treatments of the years 1888-1890. Feininger copied polyphonic music from dozens and dozens of Vatican codices. You may refer to the index by Antonio Damiano, 2004. Through his transcription, he recorded what could still be read well, photographing the state of the codices at that time. The Vatican Library had dedicated a series of its publications to the study of the Cappella Sistina, Cappelle Apostolice Sixtineque Collectanea Acta Monumenta, beginning in 1991, which includes volumes signed by the most famous scholars of this collection. The Cappella Sistina is one of the musical collections in the patrimony of the Vatican Library, which consists of about 80,000 manuscripts and 100,000 archival units. Other musical collections include Cappella Giulia, 1,293 shelf marks from the Basilica of St. Peter's, containing the books of the Basilica's cantors. Perosi, with 358 elements, a collection that takes its title from the composer Lorenzo Perosi, director of the Cappella Sistina from 1998 to 1956. The manuscripts reached the library on several occasions. Some were added to the Vaticani Latini, then they were transferred to the Vaticani Musicali, and some were joined to the collection dedicated to the composer, created at the beginning of the 90s of the 20th century, and still today in the process of organization. Arturo Sacchetti published the catalog of this collection in 2013. Ravalli, with 38 items, the collection of Pietro Ravalli, a composer and maestro of the Cappella Giulia, who introduced public concerts of classical sacred music in Rome. The collection came to the library in 1996 and contains sacred music, motets, cantatas. Vaticani Musicali, an open collection with 705 shelf marks to date, a collection established in 1956 by the scriptor Latinos Maria Saint Laurent, who isolated a group of musical manuscripts from the Vaticani Latini, which had been previously included among the high shelf marks of the collection, so as to then add the new acquisitions of musical manuscripts. Giuseppe Baronci compiled an inventory between 1932 and 1938 of what were still the Vaticani Latini Musicali. Musical manuscripts with lower shelf marks, however, were not isolated from the rest. The collection contains works that can be dated between the 16th and 20th century, with autograph pieces from various sources. It is largely a collection that has yet to be explored. Besides the collection that are entirely or mainly musical, there are also groups of manuscripts preserved in other collections, in particular the Barberiniani and the Chigiani, linked to families also known for their musical patronage. A catalogue of musical manuscripts within the Barberiniani has the added merit of having identified many composers. The one recently published by Margareta Murata and Lowell Lindgren in the Studi e Testi series of the Vatican Library, or in Archivio Capitolo di San Pietro, or in Santa Maria Maggiore. To the latter, Saxer dedicated a volume in 2001, and Rita Andolina and Susanna Greco, 1994, the catalogue of musical scores. The Vatican Library has always been, and today all the more so, a place of conservation, a place for study, for comparison, and for the promotion of research in various fields. so too for the history of music. In addition to the scholars already mentioned, among the first who dealt with musical manuscripts was Henry Marriott Bannister, musicologist and liturgist, author of the Monumenti Vaticani di Paleografia Musicale, 1913, and collaborator of the Vatican Library. There are many specialists who have studied and continue to study the Vatican musical collections, whose works were discussed in exhaustive excursus written by Arnaldo Morelli for the occasion of the 2011 Vatican Library Conference, from Bruno Stäblein, Michel Huglot, Giacomo Baroffio, Thomas Kelly, in particular on the origin of the Gregorian chant, to medieval and Renaissance polyphonic music and Cappella Sistina, Heinrich Besseler, Herbert Kellman, Mitchell Brauner, Jeffrey Dean, Pamela Starr, Thomas Schmidt, Richard Sherr, Klaus Pietschmann, Adalbert Roth, Bernard Jans, Giancarlo Rostirolla, also on the Cappella Giulia, on sacred music in Rome in the 17th and 18th centuries, and Arnaldo Morelli. The catalogue of RISM, based on the examination of manuscripts under various aspects of disciplines related to the manuscript book, offer important contributions. The digital library of the Vatican Library is continually being increased. We advance with projects which are supported by foundations and benefactors. Such projects involve the restoration, digitization, and description of manuscripts, which are nowadays closely interrelated operations within the workflow that leads to the publication of images online. The digitization of the first group of manuscripts from the Cappella Sistina collection available online was made possible thanks to the support of the Alamir project. We hope to find the necessary support soon to be able to continue with the online publication of high-definition images of the manuscript of this collection. Today, thanks to the IIIF, our digital library allows you to compare manuscripts of the Vatican Library with manuscripts preserved in other institutions and to annotate the images by choosing the elements you want to describe. And so, for centuries, there has been a network of research, collaboration, and now digital tools of fundamental importance for studies, such as those of the RISM presented today, about the musical collections of the Vatican Library. Tools that combine cataloging, searchability, and images can offer a concrete service to research, even at a distance. During this period of pandemic isolation, we are now experiencing its importance all the more. We look forward to continuing to promote research and fruitful collaboration in various ways. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn it over to Balázs Mikusi, Executive Director of the RISM Editorial Center.
Thank you, Jennifer. I hope you can hear me. I promise to be very short because this is a very long event and I see it's getting longer than we expected. Essentially, I would like to make 2 points, given that we have such a vast audience, hopefully including people who don't know everything yet about RISM. One of these points has partly been made by Professor Pietschmann before me. Namely, he mentioned that as opposed to the idea that crystallized in the past few decades, that RISM is primarily dealing with manuscripts of the period from 1600 to 1800. RISM has actually much to offer for people doing research into the 16th century, for example. I feel it's my duty to elaborate on that and emphasize that when I was at university, I was told that if I'm dealing with something after 1800, RISM is not the place to go. This is also not quite true. So we have much 19th century material now in our database. And as extreme examples, I could even mention that people cataloging with Muscat, which is our cataloging program, in different parts of the world, for example, even enter contemporary music into the RISM database. So it's not forbidden, it's a possibility. Or another type of, still an exception, but an example as well. A few years ago, we had a project together with the Richard Strauss complete edition, thanks to which the RISM database now includes very good descriptions of Richard Strauss pieces. That's also not something that you would expect normally to see in RISM. So the first point I wanted to make, feel sure to revise your ideas about RISM, because RISM keeps changing, and in the past decade or so it has been changing more rapidly than before. So feel entrusted to look for RISM even when you are looking for something that you would normally not associate with us. The other point is that the internet has of course changed everything, and RISM is no exception in that regard. I remember when I was at university and I sometimes went to the National Library in Budapest, there was a RISM cataloger there, a relatively old man sitting in his room writing by hand catalog cards, which were then posted in every couple of months to Frankfurt so that it would be edited there and so on. As you can imagine, this is not the way how it happens today. How it happens today is that catalogers, most of them, use now Muscat, this cataloging program, which only requires internet. So if you are sitting wherever in the world and you have internet, you could catalog directly into the RISM database. That is a great opportunity for most of us. And I should stress that this is also for free. So of course, you cannot just walk there and use it. You need to learn how to use it. But other than that, there are no constraints. So we are very happy to have as many people as possible entering data through Muscat. And so if in the audience we have music librarians and someone is telling you about an interesting collection that is kept in a place when there is no librarian, no library catalog, tell them about RISM. That would be an opportunity, the place where this could be kept. If it's catalog, it comes into our database and we will take care of it later on. Or if you are a musicologist, that's also a very specific example, and you are writing a project with a budget where most of the budget will be for the IT because someone wants to build a database for your project. Perhaps you should be in touch with us. It might be if you are dealing with sources and want to catalog them that you could do it with Muscat, which is for free. And then we could find a solution that is good for us because we are very happy if we have new sources, and it might be way cheaper for you as well than having your own database, which will then not be maintained and in the long run disappear from the net. And of course, if in the audience we have just merely practicing musicians, performing musicians, if you come across a collection that is not cataloged, remember what I've just said, that basically the chronological limits are now gone. Get in touch with us or get the people who possess that material in touch with us, and perhaps you can find a solution how to get it here. Having said that, I kind of realized that the 2 points are just one, which is we are changing, we are becoming ever more inclusive, and we are very open to cooperate. That's what I wanted to say on behalf of the Editorial Center, and probably a shortcut is sparing us time if I now hand over directly to Professor Pietschmann so that he would introduce the real speakers of the event.
Thank you, Balázs. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Thomas Schmidt. After having studied musicology, medieval and early modern history and Italian literature at the universities of Heidelberg and Chapel Hill, Thomas Schmidt was awarded a PhD in musicology at Heidelberg University in 1995 with a thesis on Felix Mendelssohn's musical aesthetics. Subsequently, he held various postdoctoral positions in Heidelberg as well as a Humboldt Fellowship in Urbana. In 2001, he obtained the Habilitation in Heidelberg with a study on text declamation in the 15th century motet. Thomas moved to the UK in 2005 to take up the professorship and chair of music at Bangor University. In 2012, he was appointed as professor of music at Manchester, and since 2017, he's Dean of Music, Humanities and Media at the University of Huddersfield. His research interests include many fields, for example, the instrumental music of the late 18th and 19th centuries with a focus on Mendelssohn and Mozart, musical editing, music philology, and history of musical genres. He's an expert for the music of the 15th and 16th centuries, especially for music sources. He conducted the famous PROMS project, the production and reading of music sources, which led to a variety of publications and a now indispensable online database. Thomas, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Thank you for this this very generous introduction, and it's an enormous pleasure to be here. Well, physically, of course, I'm just in my study in York, but it's an enormous pleasure to be able to speak to such an illustrious and such a large audience. And I've just been going through the list of participants, and I see a number of colleagues and very good friends. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to act as the warm-up act to Richard Sherr, obviously, as really the Spiritus Rector of Cappella Sistina manuscript research for the last number of decades. And so what I will do, I will just talk a bit about the project that led to these catalog descriptions that are being launched as part of this RISM lecture. And I will try to share my PowerPoint, and later I will also try to share something else. So it worked half an hour ago when we tried it, so with any luck, it'll work again. So a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or perhaps more precisely put, 32 years ago in 1989, the Heidelberg Academy of Humanities and Sciences began to fund a multi-year project on the history of the Papal Chapel, or history of the music at the Papal Chapel, or Cappella Sistina, directed by Ludwig Fincher and with the collaboration of the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana. The project's task was twofold. On the one hand, to excerpt and publish materials from the Vatican archives relevant to the papal singers and other musicians from the 15th and 16th centuries. On the other, to study the repertoire contained in the Fondo Cappella Sistina, principally through the preparation of a catalogue raisonné of its holdings, again with a particular focus on sources produced from the late 15th to the mid-17th century. I'd been vaguely aware of this project during my time as a student at the Department of Musicology in Heidelberg, in whose attic it somewhat mysteriously resided, together with another one on the Mannheim Court Chapel. And as fate would have it, I ended up being a student assistant on the project, and from 1995 as a full-time research assistant. As a fresh-faced postdoc, I was in heaven. Uninterrupted work on a body of fascinating sources interspersed with paid trips to the Vatican, on one of which, incidentally, I met Klaus Pietschmann in the legendary bar in the courtyard between the library and the archives. And this just as a nostalgic image to a place where many of us have been and where we all very much look forward to being able to go back to when it is once again possible to travel. My specific role was to compile the manuscript catalogue based on, at the time, microfilms of varying legibility, which made the visits to see the originals ever more crucial and rewarding. But as often happens, the funding ran out before the work ran out, and through various vicissitudes, not much of what the project produced actually saw the light of day. There is Adalbert Roth's published dissertation on Cappella Sistina 13 and 51. There are two proceedings volumes from conferences held in Heidelberg, a book-length study by Bernhard Jans on the history of the Fondo, a publication series containing works by various affiliated authors, including Klaus Pietschmann, and various articles and chapters by project researchers on a sort of ad hoc basis, if you like. But alas, the catalogue, as one of the core outcomes of the project, was left a torso when the funding ended in 2001. But what we had at least were seriously in-depth descriptions of all manuscripts, both chant and polyphony, copied before circa 1620, including copious observations on scribes, as well as descriptions of a number of early printed editions in the Fondo, prepared by Gottfried Heinz, who worked for the project during a year when I took a leave of absence in 1998-99. Our database also contained, to have at least some kind of records for all sources of the Fondo, the basic information and repertoire lists from the old catalogue of the Fondo by José María Llorens of 1960 for all the remaining items which we didn't catalogue in detail. After 2001, all the project workers moved on. Adalbert Roth became a scriptor of the Vatican Library, Gottfried Heinz moved indeed to RISM, RISM Germany, and I, after a few detours, ended up in the UK. In the meantime, my catalogue data peacefully resided on my computer, or a succession of computers, occasionally reminding me that there was substantial unfinished business there. But you know what it's like in academia. You always think, oh, I'll find a bit of time and I'll have the summer and I'll sort of sort it all out and then we'll get this published. But that bit of spare time, that just never arrives. I shared some of the data with various colleagues and a chunk of it with Diam, but there the matter rested for the time being. It is really thanks entirely to Klaus Pietschmann, who, when he became involved with RISM, very quickly suggested that this could be a home for my orphaned Cappella Sistina data. That original conversation is now itself some years in the past. If I remember correctly, it occurred during the Convegno Internazionale di Musica Sacra in Rome in 2012. But you know, Klaus, nothing if not persistent. And thus, I sit here today and I can finally present the results of our labor in electronic form, occupying a little corner of the vast realm of RISM Online. I would like to use just a few more minutes before we then move on to the main event of the evening to provide a bit of a guide through the material as it is presented in the online resource. And I would like to thank the team at the RISM Zentralredaktion who patiently worked through fairly substantial technical challenges with me to adapt my catalogue data, which was not originally designed to appear online. Remember, we started this in 1989, where the internet was no more than an idea, really. And to adapt this data to the parameters of RISM, itself not designed to accommodate highly detailed codicological descriptions. I would like to thank in this context, other than Klaus Pietschmann himself, Klaus Keil, Martina Valletta, Chantal Köppel, Stefan Hirsch, Björn Kessler for the technical implementation, and latterly Balázs Mikusi. The way the information is presented in RISM Online is thus, as you will see, something of a compromise, but a sufficiently workable one that makes it possible to search for the specific fields contained in the RISM data model, as well as to see all the more detailed information in the comments fields. As indicated, the resource contains detailed descriptions of all polyphonic manuscripts up to circa 1620. Chant, alas, not being part of RISM's remit, perhaps not yet being part of RISM's remit. And it also contains a number of printed editions, as well as the basic information from Llorens for the rest of the Fondo. The data is of course integrated into the main RISM resource and will thus come up in any general search you do on RISM. But RISM have also produced a mini site that makes it much easier to navigate the data and extract it from the main resource. And the link is on the PowerPoint slide, as you can see. I will now start sharing a different image, which is directly from the internet, from from the Sistina resource of the Vatican of RISM. Give me 2 seconds. I think that's it. Yeah. So this is the front page of that mini site with a bit of an introductory text and various search criteria. And I would just look very briefly at one example of one of the codices in the Fondo. The codex I've chosen as my example is a manuscript that many of you will know. Some of you will know very well. I think Jeff Dean, I've seen him on the list of participants in the Zoom. Cappella Sistina 45, a codex with mass settings and a few motets by the usual suspects, Josquin de Pré, Pierre Deleroux, Mouton, Fervin, Silva, and others, copied by Claudius Delandi and Jean Onceau in the early 15 teens. As you can see, the description opens with the usual basic data you would expect: siglum, place and copyists, number of folios, dimensions, watermarks, etc. Don't be surprised if most of the information is in German, because that is the language in which I assembled the data, while some of the search fields will have automatically converted the standardized information into English. It is hoped that given the highly structured information and nature of the information, even users not intimately familiar with the German language will still be able to navigate the resource. And the front page of the mini site provides some guidance as to internal structure and some of the most frequent terms and abbreviations used, including their translation into English. Now, the bulk of the codicological detail is, as you can see, in the general notes field, as it did not correspond to any of the standard RISM fields. Following information on choir structure, title pages, foliation, notation, state of preservation, it is organized by the original codicological units. Only the nerdiest of scholars will probably be interested in this level of detail. But if you want to know about rastrum sizes, ruling patterns, ink colors, initial types, here is the place where you will find all this, organized by codicological units. And this information is now, of course, complemented in many cases by digital images of the books themselves, wonderfully supplied by the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, which are linked from the descriptions. I will not test fate and actually click on the link. This is all the catalog descriptions. So down here, you have the link to the Cappella Sistina 45 digital images on the Vatlib site, directly accessible from here. Linked to this are also entries for the individual compositions in each book, broken down into parts and indicating voice layout, canons, and other paratexts, also including information on text source, original title, and composer ascription, liturgical function, and where we have it, the modern edition. One really important caveat is that the data was compiled, as mentioned, in the late 1990s, and thus reflects the state of research and my knowledge of 2 decades or more ago. The physical data, while keeping in mind that it also reflects the state of the books of that time, will in most cases not have changed. But there has, of course, been a great deal of research since then about scribes, descriptions, in some instances dating and placing, by eminent scholars such as Richard Sherr, Jeff Dean, Jesse Rodin, Klaus Pietschmann, and others. And the bibliography and listing of editions equally reflects the late 1990s or early 2000s. The ambition is, of course, to bring the information up to date on these matters, but that will take time and effort. And we decided that as long as we are upfront about this limitation, it was still preferable to get the data out into the world now and bring it up to date as and when, rather than wait for what might possibly be a fairly long time. But enough about databases. I know you have principally logged in this afternoon or evening to hear the Grand Master of all things relating to the Fondo Cappella Sistina, and a far more entertaining speaker than I could ever aspire to be, Richard Sherr. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this very inspiring introduction, which not only brought back some very dear memories to my mind, and maybe also of others, but which gave a very good insight to what our achievement is good for, how is it shaped, what was your major contribute to it, and hopefully it will be stimulating further research on this fantastic sources. Now we have some time for a few questions. So if you would like to ask Thomas Schmidt or the others involved something about this RISM catalog and this resource, please feel free to write your question in the chat.
I suspect you will probably all just want to go and play with it some and see what it is. And I know that, for example, Richard, and when he first looked at it, he spotted various things where I said, okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? So the list of abbreviations and explanations of what some of the perhaps more coded language in those descriptions mean, that list is in large part down to Richard going through it and say and looking at it. And I would welcome very much if people either sort of have information, obviously, that needs to be brought up to date, or indeed, if anything in the descriptions is not clear and can be added to the front page where we explain what it all means, then by all means, that's extremely welcome.
So there is one question, which is the entire manuscript available in RISM? I think this regards the question if you have further information which we couldn't integrate in the catalog.
If it's about the manuscript as images, then if there is a digitized version of it on the Vatican, on the Vatlib site, then yes. But if not, then no. I mean, and like I said, I think it's wonderful that ever more manuscripts are appearing on the Vatican site, and it's yeah. And I think I'm right in saying that whenever that this will also be regularly updated as sort of more manuscripts appear on the Vatican site, that those links will be updated.
An interesting question: if there's anything from Africa. I feel there will be not very much.
Not to the best of my knowledge. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a fairly polyglot and fairly sort of international chapel, and the Vatican brought together people from all over the place, but not to the best of my knowledge.
So here's a question from Thomas Neal. Have the printed editions been added to the printed sacred music database?
If they have been, I wouldn't know. I mean, you mean that this is the separate, this is not, that has nothing to do with RISM, you mean? Probably not. I mean, that's, at least, I mean, I wouldn't know.
I would say with regard to the prints, to the 16th century prints, as far as these are collected prints, these will of course be already in as part of the B1 series in the in RISM already.
Yeah.
What is your favorite source in this database?
What is my favorite source in the database? It's probably, I mean, I may speak out of turn here, it's probably one of the chant sources, which isn't actually sort of, and if it's from the Fondo, it's Cappella Sistina 10, which is sort of an office for the dead, which is utterly over the top. As sort of an early 16th century chant book, it's massive, and it's sort of, and you have to know the chant books are much more richly illuminated than any of the polyphonic books in the Fondo Cappella Sistina. I mean, from the ones that are actually in the database, because the chant books, alas, are not, it's probably Cappella Sistina 15, because it's just endlessly sort of complicated and fascinating and weird and wonderful with the Dufay arrangements and the motets, and yeah, so it's one of those books where you could probably spend a lifetime working through what it is and what it means.
So we have two more questions, and I would say are three. I think these three questions are the last ones, because then we have to go on. Mm-hmm. The first, you mentioned how long the catalog sources are, but is there anything from the medieval era described and available?
Depends on how you define medieval, isn't it? It's, I mean, because the Fondo really only goes back to the 1460s, 1470s, goes back to the foundation of the chapel as a as an institution in a much more strongly sort of institutional sense, also and then starting to assemble its own library of books. So the books themselves, and whether that's chant or polyphony, they don't. The chant books go back to the 1460s, and the polyphony books to the 1470s. So, which I suppose north of the Alps would still be the Middle Ages, but in Italy probably not. And there are earlier music sources in the Vatican Library, but given the nature of the Fondo and given sort of why and how it was set up, they aren't found in there.
So here's now a more technical question. Does there happen to be a fast and easy way to search for a manuscript by siglum? I type in VC VWAV CS16, but it's not near the top of the results.
I mean, I played around with that a bit. It's not entirely straightforward. I think the easiest I found it if you just type in CS16 in quotation marks without the VC, because VCVBAV will find everything, because everything on this microsite is a Vatican manuscript. So, but if you just put CS16 in quotation marks, you will only get a very few hits probably, and one of them will be the book.
So we see that this was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And now there's a question: how many individual items are included altogether? Do you have a total?
Only insofar as the site has the total. I mean, when you go onto onto subject, you will then see that 820 masses, 571 motets, 518 hymns, 416 antiphons. So it will give you that. It also gives you 112 operas. I'm not quite sure how that works out, but there we are. But that will give you sort of a broad sense of the number of compositions that are in this specific body of sources. And like I said, that's probably worth repeating. I mean, the inventory we did sort of at the time enter all the inventories from your ends. So although we didn't describe those sources, the content of all the books, music books from the Fondo Cappella Sistina are in here. But of course, again, sort of it's just sort of a basic list then, and as we know, sort of Jorens's terms descriptions is partly out of date. But again, the idea was we've got it, and we might as well sort of allow people to use it rather than saying, oh, sort of there might be errors in there. So I mean, it's an online database. We can go in and change things if we know they're wrong.
Okay, thank you.
May I say something? Just to the operas. So this is not filtered for the Fondo itself. It is for the library, and therefore you have items that are kept in this library but not actually belong to the items that you have now entered.
I see, because Barberini, of course, contains operas. Yes, yeah.
So I think that the introduction at the beginning of the page kind of makes that clear. That was our intention to make that clear, at least.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful to know. Yeah, I was just momentarily puzzled by the operas, because there are no actual operas in the Fondo Cappella Sistina. That would be unusual.
Yes, okay. So this very last question, if there are manuscripts with Byzantine music notation, I think we can answer this with a simple no, because well, these manuscripts, the singers didn't use this notation. Okay, so thank you very much again, Thomas, for this wonderful introduction. And now it's my pleasure to go on, and I am honored to introduce now the speaker of our lecture, Professor Richard Sherr. Richard Sherr studied musicology at Columbia University, New York City, and Princeton University, where he received his PhD in 1975 with his groundbreaking study, The Papal Chapel, circa 1492 to 1513, and its polyphonic sources. In the same year, he became a professor at Smith College, Northampton, where he is still professor of music, now emeritus. He received many honors and awards, for example, from the American Philosophical Society and the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and was a fellow of the Villa Itati, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence in 1982 to 83. He received the Palestrina Prize awarded by the Lions Club of Palestrina, Italy in 1992, and La Médaille de la Ville de Tours awarded by the city of Tours in France in recognition of his scholarly contributions to the history of music in the Renaissance. Richard Sherr is an expert for Renaissance music and especially for Josquin des Prés. I just mentioned here the Josquin Companion he edited with Oxford University Press in 2000. His central field of research, however, is the history of the papal chapel in the 15th and 16th century and its music manuscripts. In 1996 appeared his book Papal Music Manuscripts in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. A collection of many of his articles on his subject was published by Ashgate in 1999 under the title Music and Musicians in Renaissance Rome and Other Courts. And in 2016, his Opus Summum came out, the papal choir during the pontificates of Julius II to Sixtus V, 1503 to 1590, an institutional history and biographical dictionary. More recently, he's working on a completely different subject, the theater music of the Second Empire in Paris. And AR Editions is going to publish his complete edition to the Revue des Fins d'année 1857 at the Théâtre des Variétés. So I'm even more grateful that for this evening, Richard Sherr exceptionally comes back to his earlier life, so to say, and shares with us recollections of 50 years with the Fondo Cappella Sistina. And please note the slightly revised title. Dear Richard, I'm really also personally very grateful that you made it possible for us, and especially that you undertook the effort to record this lecture, to be sure that no technical complications undergo. We will run now this recording, and afterwards we have the opportunity to ask questions and discuss with Richard.
I thought I would use this talk to present some personal reflections on the topic of the Fondo Cappella Sistina and my involvement with it during the past 50 years. I will divide the talk into 4 parts: memories, a historical digression, more memories, and finally a small footnote that might be added to the online RISM material. When I first asked myself exactly how I became interested in Cappella Sistina manuscripts, at first I could not remember, but eventually it came back to me. My interest owes everything to the Princeton graduate program in musicology in the late 1960s and early 1970s. You may know the names of the music history faculty then: Louis Lockwood, Arthur Mendel, J. Merrill Knapp, Kenneth Levy. Among them, they covered what were then among the major subjects of musicology: Mendel, Bach, and Josquin; Lockwood, Josquin, Renaissance music, Beethoven; Levy, chant studies; Knapp, Handel studies. In the background was the legendary Oliver Strunk, who had created the PhD program in musicology, had taught Levy and Lockwood, had recruited Mendel, and hovered over the department like a ghost, even though he was still alive at the time. There was also someone else in the department when I arrived there in 1969, not a faculty member, but a graduate student. His name was Joshua Rifkin. More about him later. This department could be described as a temple of positivism. What has been decried as positivism by Joseph Kerman, incidentally the first PhD in musicology granted by Princeton University, and has since become something of a dirty word, was hot then. Whatever positivism actually means, one facet of it in musicology was certainly the belief that the physical nature of the sources, not the music they transmitted, could tell us valuable things about the chronology of a composer's works. The musicology faculty of the Princeton Music Department were all high priests of this type of positivism. This is what I encountered when I arrived in Princeton. Arthur Mendel was at the time preparing his edition of the St. John Passion for the Neue Bach-Ausgabe, and that work has an extremely complicated source situation. He gave a seminar on Bach that we all attended. I remember him throwing Xeroxes of the sources of the Passion, the autograph score, the parts, on the seminar table and telling us to sort them out. But the real purpose of that seminar was to critique a draft of a book, which was never published, by William H. Scheider, a very wealthy devotee of Bach and a major collector of rare books and manuscripts, who was also a real scholar and a patron. His book draft, over 1,000 typescript pages, was titled Bach Achieves His Goal. We called it BAG. The goal was the well-regulated church music that Bach mentions in his letter of resignation from his position in Mühlhausen in 1708, represented by the cycle of cantatas he composed in his first year in Leipzig, 30 May 1723 to 30 May 1724. Scheider's book was an exhaustive survey of every aspect of the first yearly cycle of Bach cantatas for Leipzig, the first Jahrgang. Such a book could not have been written before 1960. Those of you who know about Bach studies know that the very concept of a first Jahrgang was made possible only because of the revolution in Bach chronology by Alfred Dürr and Georg Dattelsen in the late 1950s, where they showed that, contrary to what had previously been thought, Bach actually composed a cantata a week in his first years in Leipzig, and that we could therefore date most of his Leipzig cantatas precisely. The point here is that the new Bach chronology was based exclusively on the examination of sources. It depended on the identification of scribes and the chronology of handwriting and watermarks, not on musical style analysis. It was perhaps the first real triumph of that kind of positivism. That, as I remember, was my first exposure to what manuscript studies could do. The exposure to this, in the context of Renaissance music manuscripts, came in Louis Lockwood's seminar at Princeton in fall 1970. But that seminar was on musica ficta, so why did I get into manuscripts? Luckily, I have saved my notes from that seminar, and going through them gradually revealed why the theoretical subject of musica ficta led to an attempt to understand and date Roman music manuscripts. Louis Lockwood approached the musica ficta from the positivistic standpoint. It was fine to learn about the theoretical underpinnings and all the rules. What Louis wanted to know was, what did the actual sources of the music say? Do they ever use written accidentals in places where the ficta rules said that they need not be written down? As a test case, Lockwood decided to use the masses of Josquin. In 1970, preparations for the big Josquin conference of 1971 were underway. We were tasked with compiling the written accidentals in all the sources of a given mass. Maybe that would tell us something about the way that singers of the time approached musica ficta. But along with that came another positivistic question. Sure, it was fine to tabulate accidentals, but we also needed to know the dates of the sources, the idea being that the closer they were to Josquin in time, the more authority they held. But how would we know that? In 1970, the study of Renaissance music manuscripts was really just beginning, but a methodology similar to the one used by the Bach scholars was being established, thanks in part to the work of Herbert Kellman, who came to Princeton in 1957 and had published his groundbreaking article on the Kiji Codex with its identification of the codices that made up the Habsburg-Burgundy complex of manuscripts in 1958. A feat he achieved by identifying the presence of the same scribal hands and miniatures in manuscripts which now are widely separated. I still have the handouts that he used when he came to talk to us about this. So, this seminar on Musica Ficta became a seminar on Josquin and the chronology of Josquin sources. I probably was assigned to look at the Vatican sources of Josquin's masses and began asking the then expected questions about dating and chronology, at which point I discovered that we knew almost nothing about the dating and chronology of Vatican music manuscripts, and that the published catalogues of the collection, Répertoire in 1888 and Llorens in 1960, were of little help. Somehow I got sidetracked by Cappella Sistina 15, not a source of Josquin's masses. I don't remember how or why. Here, the appearance of what seemed clearly to be French heraldry was completely ignored in the published catalogues. Trying to sort that out involved me in a lot of historical research about Charles VIII and his trip to Italy. So when it came time for me to give a paper in this seminar on Musica Ficta, I instead talked about the chronology of Vatican manuscripts and their scribes, particularly of Cappella Sistina 15, a manuscript in which the seminar had no interest whatsoever. At least that's what I think I did. I don't actually have the submitted paper. Maybe I never submitted it. I do remember giving the presentation, and I have the notes I used for that. It did not go over particularly well, as I remember. But at least I had models of how I could approach the question. And I was certainly not the first to concern myself with the complex of manuscripts that resided in the Vatican Library in the Fondo Cappella Sistina. Historical digression. I begin with a document that provides perhaps the first discussion of the physical characteristics of Sistine manuscripts and also illustrates why we are fortunate that the private musical archive of the papal singers established in the late 15th century is now the Fondo Cappella Sistina of the Vatican Library. The document is a letter that Giuseppe Baini, then the Direttore Perpetuo of the papal choir, wrote to Auguste Bottet de Toulmont, librarian of the Conservatoire de Paris, dated Rome, 31 May 1840, which is well known to people who know about such things. Baini explains why he cannot accede to the request Toulmont had made to be sent copies of the oldest polyphonic works in the library of the papal singers. This is the letter. My translation. I will read the passage in red. During the pontificate of Innocent XIII, it was suddenly learned that the musical archive of the chapel had secretly suffered a second sack equal to that of Bourbon's. All efforts were made to discover, if not the author of the theft, then at least the number of books and folios that had been removed, but it was all futile. Therefore, this supreme pontiff ordered that all the remaining folios be collected. They were newly bound in volumes and were kept more securely with 3 keys given to 3 different officers of the chapel. The person who was entrusted with this task did his work in 1721, 22, and 23, but because of negligence or ignorance, not considering the age, the authors, the works, put the folios together as he found them, and created many volumes of the same size, so that in order to find a complete mass, it was necessary to open and examine 10, 12, 15 large volumes, and many times uselessly, because of the absence of the stolen folios, and especially those with initial miniatures. To this must be added that since the books are written on paper, frequently the ink has bled through the entire staves, so that having with difficulty reunited the folios of a mass, pages are lost because of the bleed-through. How can anyone be asked to transcribe books in this state? As is usual with Baini, this is a mixture of fact and fiction. It is true that many volumes and folios that were in the music library of the singers have disappeared, but this was discovered in 1687, not the 1720s, and led to the first catalogue of the collection, the Panuzzi catalogue. It is also true that Innocent XIII ordered many of the volumes to be rebound, and that many codices are miscellanies containing works copied at different times, and that some of the miscellanies could be the result of the rebinding. It is also true that a number of miniatures have been cut out from some Cappella Sistina sources, and that some manuscripts have extreme bleed-through that makes some of the folios difficult to decipher. But it most definitely was not true. In fact, it was a bald-faced lie that the volumes of the musical archive were rebound in the 1720s in a chaotic state with random folios thrown together, making it difficult to reconstruct complete masses, or that the loss of folios or ink bleed-through is so extensive as to render many entire works illegible. Baini in 1840 had access to 3 catalogues of the collection, as well as the sources themselves, and knew perfectly well that the oldest sources of polyphony, Cappella Sistina 14 and 51, were intact. He simply did not want to share the music with tout le monde, or perhaps did not want to do, or was not even able to do, the work of transcription of 15th century mensural notation. So he directs tout le monde away from the archive of the papal singers to 2 parchment manuscripts of polyphony, both now in the Vatican Library, the Chigi Codex and San Pietro B80, which are in fact in excellent condition. The Chigi Codex could indeed have been copied yesterday. Just a little more history, which you probably also know. As long as the manuscripts remain the property of the papal choir, access could be restricted or denied. But once they moved to the Vatican Library in 1870, they became accessible. In 1888, Franz Xaver Haberl published a catalogue of the collection, giving varying amounts of information about the physical makeup of the sources, and sometimes, but not always, listing the contents. One of his longer entries concerns Cappella Sistina 22, where Haberl takes pains to list the contents and also to describe the physical characteristics of the source, something he does not do for every manuscript. Why here? It concerns the eternal debate about when and why Palestrina composed the Missa Papae Marcelli, whose earliest Vatican source is this manuscript. Baini had used the date of 1565, which appears on one folio of Cappella Sistina 22. Another folio has the date 1568, to argue that Palestrina's Mass was copied then and composed then to be one of the Masses performed in Cardinal Vitelli's palace on 28 April 1565, when the singers were summoned to sing some Masses and to test whether the words could be understood. Haberl wanted to argue that the Mass was in fact composed before 1555 and was connected to Marcellus II when he was still Cardinal Marcello Cervini. In order to do that, he had to destroy Baini's argument. So he points out that the date of 1565 in Cappella Sistina 22 does not appear in the Missa Papae Marcelli, and in any case is meaningless, since it is clear that Cappella Sistina 22 was created at some unknown time. He actually postulates that it happened in the 18th century by binding together separate fascicles that were at the very least 3 years apart in copying. That the Missa Papae Marcelli happens to be in a manuscript which contains 2 pieces copied in the 1560s is an accident and means nothing for the chronology of the Mass. Thus he describes what we know to be true of all the 15th and 16th century Sistina manuscripts, that they are miscellanies and that dating any part of a codex in no way dates the entire codex. This argument is amplified in Haberl's article Die Kardinalskommission von 1564 und Palestrines Missa Papae Marcelli in Kirchenmusikalisches Jahrbuch, Volume 7 of 1892, where he repeats his description of Cappella Sistina 22 and adds a consideration of the other early Roman source of the Mass, Santa Maria Maggiore 18, now 29, and argues that this source was older than Cappella Sistina 22. Haberl was in turn demolished in what is arguably the first real scholarly discussion of the physical structure of the Sistine sources, which appeared in Knud Jeppessen's article Marcellus Probleme, einige Bemerkungen über die Missa Papae Marcelli des Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina in Acta Musicologica 16-17 of 1944-45. Jeppessen's argument about the date of the Missa Papae Marcelli, he places it in the 1560s, was mainly stylistic, but he did include in this article a discussion of the physical characteristics of the Roman manuscript sources of the Mass that he had published in 1930. In this discussion, Jeppesen, I think for the first time, describes the unique characteristic of Sistina manuscripts, that they are single sheets of large paper made into bifolia and then made into fascicles, which were bound into codices. He then demonstrates, by examining the fascicle structure of Cappella Sistina 22, that it was not a random miscellany created in the 18th century, as Haberl had claimed, but was created in its present form by its scribe, Johannes Parvus, sometime in the late 16th century. Jeppesen then uses watermark evidence to prove that the Santa Maria Maggiore manuscript, which Haberl had thought was earlier than Cappella Sistina 22, was in fact much later. He also says that he was present when Cappella Sistina 63 was rebound in 1929, saw the way the original gatherings were created, and personally observed that different paper types were bound together into bifolia. He thus presents the methodology for dealing with Sistina manuscripts that we all use today in a clear way for the first time. Having done all of that, he then declares that it was all useless, that the sources, in fact, tell us nothing about the actual date of the Missa Papae Marcelli, and continues his argument on stylistic grounds. Jump to the late 1960s. In 1968, the University of Chicago Press published a massive 3-volume edition consisting of a facsimile of the manuscript now in the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana with the call number Acquisti e Doni 666, which had been dubbed by its editor Edward Lewinsky as the Medici Codex, followed by a complete transcription of the music and a volume of historical commentary and critical notes. As far as I know, no manuscript of Renaissance music, indeed no manuscript of music, period, had ever been given such a lavish treatment. Now, one of Lewinsky's characteristics as a scholar was to come up with grand, elaborate, complicated, and very attractive theories with wide-ranging historical implications on the basis of evidence which on the surface looks strong, but which tends to dissolve upon further inspection. I am sure that you know that his theory about the Medici Codex was that it was prepared in France at the behest of Francis I as a gift for Lorenzo dei Medici, Duke of Urbino and nephew of Pope Leo X, on the occasion of his marriage to Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne at the Château d'Amboise on 2 May 1518. This made the manuscript an important historical document. Francis I was, after all, the quintessential Renaissance king, employer of Leonardo da Vinci, the builder of the Château de Chambord, etc., etc. And who could have been the editor of the Codex? Why, none other than Jean Mouton, Francis's court composer at the time. It also meant that Costanzo Festa had to have been in France when he composed the works that are transmitted by the Medici Codex. The evidence behind the theory was the repertory of the manuscript, and that was in fact the only evidence for Lewinsky's theory. As was typical of him, but to his credit, Lewinsky mentions but discounts or ignores various bits of evidence that might interfere with his grand theory. That the repertory also reflected the tastes of Leo X, that the arms of Leo X, Cardinal Giulio dei Medici, Lorenzo dei Medici, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne appear in the Codex, but the arms of Francis I do not, that the illuminator of the opening folios was a Florentine who worked in Rome, and also something else that Lewinsky mentions on pages 60 to 63 of the commentary volume, that the hand of the main scribe of the Medici Codex, his Gothic 1, turns up in some folios of Cappella Julia 12.2. He even provides a facsimile. Lewinsky treats this scribal concordance as a curious coincidence of no importance. He does not see or refuses to see the implications. If the scribe of the Medici Codex was working in Rome, then this is possible evidence that the Medici Codex was produced in Rome. Lewinsky ignores the implications because, I assume, for him, the mere fact of a scribal concordance, positivism, could in no way upset a grand theory based on ideas, humanism. Besides, the scribe could have traveled to France to work on the commission. Who was to say that he hadn't? But of course, the reviewers of the Medici Codex edition did say that he hadn't. The first was Lehman Perkins, who pointed out that the hand of the first scribe of the Codex was also present in Cappella Sistina 46, strengthening the Roman connections of this scribe. Perkins drew the conclusion that Lewinsky refused to draw, that the scribal concordances meant that the manuscript was copied in Rome in the court of Leo X. Why am I telling you this? Because in 1968, Joshua Rifkin was commissioned by the editor of JAMS to review the Medici Codex edition. When Joshua independently came upon the scribal concordances with Roman manuscripts, he also drew the obvious conclusions, but decided, as Lehman had not, that in order to support his theory, he had to learn about all the relevant papal music manuscripts. That is, he had to see them, to study them, and most importantly, to date them. This is where I enter the picture. When I arrived at Princeton in 1969, Joshua was already well underway on the research for what was to be his Princeton dissertation on the music manuscripts prepared in Rome in the pontificates of Leo X and Clement VII, and had already subjected a number of Sistine sources to the type of close analysis that Jeppesen had used. He actually had not read Jeppesen's article at the time. He had, in fact, done all the things I was going to do, stages of scribal hands and watermarks. Was I aware of this? You bet. We must have discussed it. I even have some notes that Joshua made on chapel scribes, including the scribe I later identified as Jean Orceau. I also have a long letter from him dated 21 June 1971, where he lays out in great detail the situation of Cappella Sistina 45 and 46. This was after I had become interested in the manuscripts, but before I had decided that they were to be my dissertation topic. Joshua has since confirmed that this was indeed the case. Interestingly, I had forgotten all about it. It came back to me only when I reread his scribal concordance article of 1973 and found the following footnote. So I can take no credit for having originated this field of research or for having developed the methodology. Some of Joshua's research on Vatican manuscripts in relation to the Medici Codex was published in his scribal concordance article of 1973, where he discusses the scribal hands and specifies the exact folios in Roman manuscripts copied by Gothic I, and I think for the first time identifies the second scribe of the Medici Codex, Lewinsky's Gothic II, as the main scribe of a number of Cappella Sistina manuscripts. In 1973, I had not finished my dissertation. But in the end, neither Joshua's dissertation nor his review ever appeared, so by default, I became the first to complete a dissertation on a group of Sistina manuscripts. But, amazingly, Lewinsky was behind it all. He is not the sole reason Joshua became interested in Sistina manuscripts, but Joshua admits that he, quote, definitely tipped me over the edge, unquote. More memories. In 1971, I decided that the Sistina manuscripts that were earlier than those that Joshua was studying would be the subject of my dissertation. I recall the excitement of calling up my first manuscript, I think it was Cappella Sistina 42, and lugging it to my seat at the back of the manuscript reading room of the Vatican Library and trying to look at it there until it was pointed out that there were those big lecterns in the front of the room, and that is where I had to be. Every year after that, I made sure to be among the first people in the library so I could snag one of those lecterns. This went on for 30 years. But I had no training in codicology. I knew nothing about the correct way to describe manuscripts. I only had the methodology I had picked up at Princeton, that scribes and watermarks could mean something. So I did the best I could with the sources. But in the end, they accounted for only half of my dissertation, the first part of which ended up as a study of the members of the papal choir in the period that the manuscripts were created, another positivistic project. I note with some amusement that my original dissertation proposal included the unpositivistic goal of a study of the music that the manuscripts transmitted. That part was dropped completely. The dissertation was finished and accepted by Princeton in 1975, as I was beginning my job at Smith College. I had presented some of the material in the dissertation at an AMS meeting in 1974, which became an article accepted for publication by the Musical Quarterly in 1976, even though it did not appear until 1977. In 1974, I learned from die Musikforschung that Ludwig Fincher and Helmut Hucke were teaching a seminar at the University of Frankfurt on the repertoire of the Papal Chapel in the 16th century, and that they had even made a field trip to the Vatican Library. I thought that was interesting, but didn't know what to do about it. But it turned out that they heard about me because Helmut Hucke was friends with Lewis Lockwood, who mentioned to him that he had a student who had just completed a dissertation on Sistine sources. This prompted a letter from Hucke to me, dated 29 March 1976, in which he asks for a copy of my dissertation. As it happened, the dissertation had just been microfilmed by University Microfilms, and I wrote to him that I would send him a copy. In that letter, I mentioned that I was making a research trip to Europe in late June 1976. A phrase in Helmut's answer to my letter, dated 9 April 1976, has stayed with me ever since. Die Nachricht, dass Sie voraussichtlich in späten Juni in Europa sein werden, hat mich elektrisiert. And he invited me to come to give a presentation in the seminar in June. Since I had never electrified anybody before or since, I, of course, accepted, and we set the date of 28 June for the visit. Helmut offered to put me up for part of the time and to meet me at the airport. I do not have this letter, but I remember distinctly that he told me that I would recognize him because he would be carrying a copy of the Jorens catalog. I also remember distinctly that when we first met at the airport, we looked at the catalog and simultaneously said, "That's all it's good for." But of course, that was 44 years ago, and memories played tricks. Still, it's a good story. Anyway, I made my presentation in English to the seminar. They seemed interested, especially one of them, Adalbert Roth, who I met then for the first time. Thus began my association with Fincher, Hucke, and Roth, and the Sistine project, now incorporated into RISM. I do not know how Fincher and Hucke became interested in the Sistina sources. It certainly was not because of me. In my career, there has been usually a large gap between the acceptance of a book by a press and its final publication. In the 21 years that separated the completion of my dissertation from the published book drawn from it, I learned a lot. I found a model of codicological description in the format used by the Census Catalog of Manuscript Sources of Polyphonic Music 1400 to 1550, which had begun publication in 1979. Meanwhile, two American scholars, Jeffrey Dean and Mitchell Browner, wrote dissertations on collections of Sistina manuscripts, greatly refining the methodology I had used, and Adalbert Roth went further and subjected two manuscripts, Cappella Sistina 14 and 51, to a full paleographical analysis, resulting in a book of 650 pages. All these studies came out before my study, published in 1996, Dean and Browner in 1984, Roth in 1991. And all of them, unlike my dissertation, were concerned solely with manuscripts. In particular, Jeffrey Dean subjected the hand of my scribe Orso to a depth of analysis that I had not dreamed possible, nor would I have had the patience to do it, and came up with a very precise chronology that tracked the evolution of Orso on a year-by-year basis, something I had not done. This certainly made me look at it all again in a new light as I prepared my book. Meanwhile, the Sistina project, which had begun in the Frankfurt seminar, continued on, resulting finally in the material in the RISM site that we are considering today. Just a few words about that. I have looked at the entries for my manuscripts and am impressed by the amount of information in the notes, far more than in my catalog or in Dean's dissertation. But it still needs some editing. For instance, I noticed in the notes for Cappella Sistina 42 that a phrase about folio 58 verso, which appears in the notes for the 9th fascicle, appears in the notes for all the following fascicles, no doubt a result of the cut-paste function. That, unfortunately, makes one wonder about the other repeated material in the notes. I was particularly interested in the remark that the individual sheets of Carta Reale had originally been folded in half, Knickspuren im Blattmitte noch zu sehen. This would appear to mean that the paper came to the chapel scribes as bifolia, which then had to be straightened out. As it turns out, the registers of supplications are constructed of bifolia of Carta Reale. Since that was the only other papal department that had need of this type of paper, it looks as if they and the chapel were using the same provider who supplied the paper already folded. Or did the chapel scribes raid the folded paper stores of the supplications when they needed paper? Unfortunately, the watermarks don't match up enough to support that theory. I also wonder what the observation that the folios of the Cappella Sistina 14 also have Knickspuren might mean for determining the origins of that source, now generally believed not to be Rome, although nobody can agree as to where it was copied. I leave that for someone else to decide. I conclude with my footnote. Back to the scribes of the Medici Codex, on which topic, believe it or not, I actually have something new to add. We now know that the second scribe, Lewinsky's Gothic II, who appears in many Cappella Sistina manuscripts, datable in the pontificate of Leo X, is most likely the official scribe of the chapel, Claudius Gelandi, who is listed as Scriptor Librorum Cappellae in the roll of Leo's court in 1514 and is called Librorum Cappellae Nostrae Scriptor in papal documents in 1516 and 1518. Dean provides a detailed description of Gelandi's hand. I can now add some more information about him. One is that he probably was born in the town of Saint-Trivier-de-Courte, about 20 miles north of Bourg-en-Bresse, since he claimed in 1507 to be a member of the family that had the collation of the benefice in the local church, at which time he described himself as a familiaris continuus commensalis, a member of the papal household. This is the document. This is a transcription. Bourg-en-Bresse, originally part of the Archdiocese of Lyon, was erected as a separate diocese in 1515 and suppressed in 1534. Hence, the pre-1515 documents for Gelandi refer to him as Clericus Lugdunensis Diocesis, cleric of the Diocese of Lyon, as here, while post-1515 documents refer to him as Clericus Lugdunensis Seuburgiensis Diocesis, cleric of the Diocese of Bourg-en-Bresse. He was in Rome at least as early as 1504, when he requested permission to receive the first tonsure in Rome. That is that document. Transcription. Gelandi was therefore in Rome for 10 years before being listed as the scribe of the chapel in 1514, which supports Dean's suggestion that he probably was working as Orso's assistant and probably took over the job as soon as Orso died in November 1512. In fact, the total payment to the chapel in November and December 1512 does not decrease by 2 ducats, which was Orso's salary, suggesting that he was immediately replaced. I can also now report that Giulandi died himself on or shortly before 15 July 1522, during the first year of the pontificate of Adrian VI. This is the date of the first supplication requesting one of the benefices left vacant by his death. That's this document. Transcription. I can also report that he was immediately replaced by Johannes Maria de Burisetis, a cleric of the Diocese of Ferrara, who calls himself Scriptor Librorum Cappellae, in a supplication dated 15 September 1522, a request to permute a benefice he possessed in the Cathedral of Aix-en-Provence with the parish church of San Giacomo Oltrepo in the Diocese of Ferrara, possessed by Thomas Lupi, who had been a singer in the Ferrarese chapel. Burisetis thus was the first Italian official scribe of the chapel, Orso and Giulandi were French. That is this document. Transcription. In 2001, Lewis Lockwood published a list of payments for music copying in Ferrara in the early 16th century. It includes references to a music scribe with a name rendered as Giovanni Maria Borseto or Giovanni Maria Borseto, who is given lined paper and ink in order to copy music for Alfonso d'Este in April 1505. This person is also probably the son of Tommaso Borseto, who was paid for having a quaternion of paper lined and for varnish for notating on 31 October 1504, and the Joan Maria Lockwood could not read the last name, who was paid by Burriero Cantore Antoine Brouillet for paper in order to notate. These are the Lockwood transcriptions. Even though these entries are 17 years earlier than the appointment of Johannes Maria de Burisetis as the scribe of the papal chapel, I think it is clear that they must refer to the same person. But what had Giovanni Maria Burisetis Borseto been doing in those 17 years? It turned out that he had a day job. Burisetis Borseto was not the scribe of the papal chapel for long. He died on or before 13 October 1522. And as was usual, his benefices were distributed to other members of the papal chapel, in this case, the singers Paolo Trotti and Bernardo Pisano, who submitted supplications asking for Burisetis' benefices on 13 October 1522. Pisano's supplication asks for another benefice that Burisetis possessed in Ferrara. In this supplication, Burisetis is described only as Scriptor Cappellae Nostre. Trotti's supplication is for the very benefice that Burisetis had received via permutation on 15 September 1522. It also adds another bit of information. That's this document. Transcription. As the transcription shows, in red, during the pontificate of Leo X, Burisetis' position was not that of a scribe, but as a paraphreniarius or palafreniere. Technically, a paraphreniarius was a stable boy, or one who led a rider on a horse or mule, but to be a papal paraphreniarius was entirely different. The palafrenieri were charged with protecting the Pope within the papal palace. They were organized as a college and even had their own room, the Camera dei Palafrenieri, in the Vatican Palace. They carried the Pope on his portable throne, the sedia gestatoria. They led the white horse that the Pope rode on, and they also acted as papal couriers on important diplomatic missions. They also participated in the privileges regarding benefices that were granted to members of the papal household. That the music scribe Burisetis was a palafreniere also indicates that they could have other talents not connected with their day jobs. And that is what brings us back to the Medici Codex. On 8 November 1518, Johannes Maria Borsetto Palafrenero was paid 10 gold cameral ducats for having gone to Florence to present a book to His Excellency the Duke. The Duke was Lorenzo de' Medici, the recipient of the Medici Codex, who had returned to Florence in September 1518 and had celebrated his second marriage to Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne there, which culminated in a dinner given on 8 September, for which occasion Raphael's portrait of Leo X had been rushed to Florence so that it could be hung over the main table. The courier who brought the painting to Florence was to be given 12 ducats for his work. Now, 10 gold cameral ducats was a lot of money to give to someone who was transporting a book, not a large, heavy painting. It was 2 ducats more than the monthly salary of a papal singer. So I suggested that this was a very special book, that it was, in fact, the Medici Codex, which is, in fact, called a book in the dedicatory poem on folio 0 verso. But then there is the name of the palafrenero who was so highly compensated for carrying this book, Johannes Maria Borsetto. This leads to the following hypothesis. Given that the main scribe of the Medici Codex, Lewinsky's Gothic I, Dean's Medici scribe, was Italian, this is a Lewinsky conclusion that everyone has accepted. Given that the Gothic I Medici scribe is present in a few folios incorporated in Roman manuscripts, Cappella Julia 12.2 and CS Cappella Sistina 46. Given that for a few months before his death in 1522, Johannes Maria de' Burisetis, a cleric from Ferrara, who must be identical to the Ioanne Maria Borsetto, paid for copying music in Ferrara in 1505, was the official scribe of the papal chapel. Given that before becoming the official scribe of the chapel, Borsetto was a member of the papal household as a palafreniere. Given that a palafreniere named Johannes Maria Borsetto was paid a hefty sum of money for having presented a book to Lorenzo de' Medici in November 1518, given that that book was probably the Medici Codex, I suggest, therefore, that the palafreniere, Johannes Maria Borsetto, is the music scribe, Johannes Maria de' Burisetis, Ioanne Maria Borsetto, and this person is Gothic I Medici scribe. The reason he was given the task and was so highly compensated for presenting a book to Lorenzo is because he had created it. His work on that codex would have certainly qualified him to take over from Giulandi, and his very short tenure would explain why we have so few examples of his hand in Sistine sources. Further, his continuing connections with Ferrara and with a member of the ducal chapel lends support to Lockwood's suggestion that the road that brought the repertory of the Medici Codex to Rome went through Ferrara. Will this conclusion hold up? Who knows? But if it does, a slight adjustment could be made to the notes accompanying folios 116 to 122 of Cappella Sistina 46 in the RISM online catalog. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Richard, for this wonderful lecture, which gives us so many insights in your personal experiences with the papal manuscripts, full of interesting and also funny details. And At the same time, it was a very vivid overview over the history of the papal manuscript and its research, and it was so wonderful to see during the lecture people you were naming contributed to the chat. I saw Joshua Rifkin, I saw Mitch Browner, and also Jeffrey Dean. So this is really wonderful. And I personally was also remembered, especially in the context of your wonderful positivistic footnote, that these positivistic efforts and results were also a very important reason for me to work on this fascinating field of research. So thank you very much. And now we have time for discussion and time for questions. And well, it would be nice to invite, for example, Joshua Rifkin, who was the first who commented, to add his comments personally. Please, Jennifer Ward, could you make it possible if he's willing to do it?
Sure. Let me see.
I see that he corrected me.
Are you surprised?
No.
Okay. Apologies on that one, Richard. Otherwise, congratulations. It's a fantastic presentation, and many thanks for the generosity with which you refer to my own role in this process. I'd only like to take the time to add two more names to the, or rather, two more wrinkles to the story that you tell. First of all, about my own involvement with the manuscripts. This owed a great deal to Martin Picker, whom I met in Florence in 1966 or 67, when he was the editor of JAMS. And it was Martin who took what was indeed the very courageous step to invite me to review Lewinsky's publication for the journal. It was something that did not sit well at all with Lewinsky, I'll have to say. That's one of the reasons why I somehow never managed to get the review completed, despite spending years writing it. So Martin, I think, has a very key role to play here. And I was able to dedicate the article that I eventually published in JAMS on the Medici Codex to, sadly, his memory. He had died before it appeared. The other thing that I could contribute might have some implications for the involvement of Hucke and Fincher in Frankfurt with the Sistine Chapel manuscripts. I first met Hucke in the winter of 1969 when I came up to visit Brandeis University about the prospect of a job there. And Helmut was guest professor at the time. And I remember being introduced. Now, a couple of years earlier, I had made a recording of Beatles songs arranged as 18th century music, which was called the Baroque Beatles Book. And when I was introduced to Hucke, he said, but I see now it's Medici Beatles Book. So he was aware of my involvement with the Medici Codex, and we did speak some of this. And if memory serves me correctly, when Fincher was in New York in 1971 for the Josquin conference, we also talked some about Roman manuscripts. Certainly I talked with Fincher at the time. Whether Roman manuscripts were included or not, I can't absolutely say. But I can add that, in fact, I was invited to Frankfurt shortly afterwards to do what you did not so long afterwards, and address a seminar on the manuscripts. That's where I also first met Adalbert Roth. So it may be that this is another link in the chain that ultimately has brought us Thomas's splendid catalog.
Thanks, Joshua. I had a feeling it was you again who got them interested into it, but I didn't. They never told me. I can tell you.
If nobody else, I have a small comment about the paper, if I may.
Of course.
The folding sort of lines that go across, I mean, they're practically everywhere. And they're also in lots of manuscripts that aren't part of the papal chapel. I mean, Joshua made the comment in the chat is that this principle that you have the very large books that you take bifolia and fold them out and create sort of double bifolia, if you like, with paper strips or parchment strips. I mean, since they would have bought these papers, this paper from stationers already folded, because you buy paper in booklets. So all these papers, every paper you would buy from a stationer would have that fold in the middle, regardless of what it would sort of then be used for. And like I said, it's highly prevalent. You find it literally everywhere in these types of books, that you see that the paper was originally folded in the middle.
Oh, that's very interesting. I actually asked Jane Bernstein about that. I don't know if she's still.
Yeah, she's there.
And she told me the opposite.
Okay.
that she had not noticed these folds.
Yeah, it's my understanding that, yes, paper would be sold in quaternions or whatever, but that did not necessarily mean gatherings as we think, but simply 5 sheets, which could be flat. For what it's worth, I know it was the practice in printmaking studios to fold a newly printed artistic print to hang it up to dry.
Mm-hmm.
So there is another instance in which folding could be introduced, whether or not that's relevant to these manuscripts, but we might consider that as well.
I think Jane wants to say something. Can we unmute her? I'm going to try to unmute you. Now you've disappeared.
Maybe it might be also interesting to unmute Mitch Browner, who also wrote comments in the chat. So if Mitch is,
yeah, I'm here.
There you are.
Okay, now I'm okay.
Now Jane's been unmuted.
Sorry.
You go first, Jane.
Thanks. I just wanted to say something about the paper. Okay, so in terms of printing, since I'm dealing with Roman printing throughout the 16th century, there are what we call broadsheets. That is to say, the paper is a full sheet of paper, not folded to make a folio. And then, as Richard Sherr has mentioned, and then they're put into these slots and made by folium, by being pasted together that way. None of the papers I've seen, and I'm thinking now of the 1580s books of Victoria and Guerrero prints, those are in broadsheet format, and none of those are folded, have folds. So my hunch is that these papers, and I don't know who else mentioned something about seeing prints that have folds, large sheets of paper. Now, that I have not seen that in the case of most of the printed, and there aren't that many, to be quite honest, because these are huge books, printed books in broadsheet that have folds. That's very unusual. And I think that it could be where the books were being delivered, and the paper was being delivered, if it was from Fabriano going to, say, the Vatican, which is what I told Richard, and that's the way they always wanted their paper, then of course they would fold it. But I don't think that was a standard practice of paper makers.
Okay.
Am I on?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, to add that whether they were folded or not, quaternions was the terminology that was used to describe the little batches of paper. And I would also point out that selling paper in quaternions continues. I don't know whether today, but in 1978, I bought a whole bunch of manuscript paper at Ricordi outside Piazza Venezia, and they were all groups of 5 heavy stock music manuscript paper. And one other point in the saga of the study of these things was Joshua's seminar at Brandeis in 1971-72. And there, that is where I developed my interest in the Vatican manuscripts. And particularly, I was in charge of dealing with this whole batch of microfilms, which we had ordered. And I was looking at the Cappella Sistina manuscripts and then we discussed in the seminar the sources of Josquin's music, I believe, at that time. And I made a few comments about the masses or the manuscripts in the masses. And that's where my saga began with all of this. That's it.
Well, one thing I thought was interesting about the Knickspuren is that I had never noticed them. And I'd been staring at those manuscripts for 30 years, and it never occurred to me that they had those folds in them. Adalbert, of course, has always made the case that the paper came from the supplications.
I mean, what I mean is, I don't think the Knickspuren proves that one way or another, because they're in the manuscript, you see them too often, and there were just there's Daniele Filippi in the chapters. I mean, you find them in Milan in the Libroni. So they wouldn't prove Adalbert's thesis, is really what I'm trying to say, because they're too prevalent. And it's one of those things. Once you start seeing them, you see them everywhere. It's
Yeah, I see Jeffrey is adding.
Yes, indeed. Yes, maybe we can unmute also Jeff Dean, if he's interested too.
Certainly.
Hello.
Hi, Jeff.
Good to see you all, and thank you so much, Richard. That was absolutely splendid. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about some of these issues quite recently. There was one thing that you pointed out, Richard, that that all of the Sistine manuscripts are composite. And I think that's only physically true. I think quite a few of them were actually designed as unitary choir books and then copied piecemeal rather than being assembled fortuitously. I think that applies to all four of the 15th century big manuscripts and to a good few of the early 16th century ones. In particular, CS 16, 26, and 45. The individual units were copied separately and out of order, but I think the scribes had it in mind to make a complete book when they started out, because all of these were copied in a fairly short period of time. And there are a number of others where the copying was extended over a much longer period, and there the idea that they were assembled post facto does apply.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
If I may add, all of the motet books from the main part of the 16th century were assembled in roughly the same way, including the Medici Codex, even though it was a folio manuscript rather than a broadsheet manuscript. But they start copying and then add in a little bit here, a little bit there, and then decide ultimately what the order is going to be and put it all together. And all of the motet manuscripts that I've dealt with, CS 24, CS 38, were all constructed in this way. And I think Jeff's right that at least a number of them are demonstrably that conceived of as a unit, as a whole, before copying.
Yeah, well, of course, Cappella Sistina 42 is in the order of liturgical year. I mean, somebody made the decision.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Yes.
But of course,
sorry, in the chat, Peter Urquhart was asking if Cappella Sistina 23 might be added to that list, and Peter would like to comment on this question. We can also unmute him.
It just a sense that I have that CS23 also has something of a unified conception. So I'm happy to hear that Mitch and Jeffrey bring up this topic.
I think.
Yes, and Joshua has also to add something. Please, Joshua.
Thanks. I'd like to suggest that, again, there's a variety of ways these things happen, and very often it's somewhere between the two things. There's no question that, let's say, every few years or so, they put stuff together into a choir book. In other words, it's not so totally miscellaneous. But one wonders how much advanced planning there is, or if not, let's say, at a certain early stage of what's happening, they're copying individual pieces, but somewhere in the back of their minds, they know it's going to become assembled into a book at a certain point. I think of a very nice image that Robert Marshall had of J.S. Bach composing his vocal music. He's saying when he starts out, he has a pretty general idea of where he's going to go, and as he works through the piece, that idea becomes more and more specific until finally the work is done. And I think that might be a better image for the extent, for the amount of planning, or let's say foresight, that's involved here. They know that something will happen. Of course, this allows, let's say, a possibility closer to Jeffrey's that indeed they have a pretty exact idea of what will happen, but sometimes maybe indeed, as particularly with motet manuscripts, they're copying the motets as they come, as they need them, but sooner or later they're going to get assembled.
I think I was going to agree with that. Really, I mean, this mixture of sort of being sort of partly it's ex post facto, that is, you have something that looks like a plan, but it's actually, because I've recently done some work also with the Alhambra codices, where it's sort of very similar situation where you have all these masses, and every one of these books looks like it's planned from beginning to end in terms of the illumination, in terms of the repertoire. But they're all different, and they're all sort of put together. And how much of that was simply that you put together what you've got in a way that makes it look like there was a grand plan, or whether there was a grand plan and then you start copying based on that is sort of hard to say. Incidentally, I'm on a totally different topic. I've just had an email from the president of the Heidelberg Academy of Humanities and Sciences, who I wrote telling him about the project, and he congratulates RISM and everybody involved on the achievement. And I think he's a very happy man because, of course, if you have a project that ended 20 years ago with one main outcomes having happened, and that's sort of out of the blue, he has an outcome for one of his projects. I think he's pleased.
Just one more.
Sorry.
Yeah, one more thing about the copying. I think Jeffrey Dean pointed out. Of course, when the things were originally copied as fascicles, those are fairly easy to transport, and large manuscripts are not easy to transport. And so it was easier to sing from the things when they were fascicles. So it isn't clear exactly why they put them into manuscripts, maybe just to stack them in the library at that point, not to use them again.
There I would add, let's say something you learn with 17th century sources, that when they're in fascicles and they're easier to store, the easiest way to store them is to fold them over.
Okay.
As I say, you look at 17th century sources and you see this all the time, that they've been folded for storing.
Could I just add something about what Thomas was saying about the online RISM catalog. I actually looked at it in the news site, and I discovered that when I can put up the information about the manuscripts in German, a Google Translate thing appeared, and I clicked it, and it all turned into English. So in fact, it is possible to see it into English. And a fairly good it must have been done by an algorithm, but it looked perfectly okay. So it can be done. So we non-German readers can actually read.
What is the Google translation of Knickspuren?
Creases, which is what the translation is.
Exactly. Oh wow, that's great.
Creases.
I would have expected Google Translate to make a complete garble of this, but it is actually legible.
Try it out, see what happens.
Really great. Okay, so I see that the number of the participants is going down a bit. So
sorry.
I would love to continue these discussions, because it brings me back to happy times. But I think it's now a good moment to make a break, at least. Afterwards, if you want, we can continue to discuss, but let me thank you again officially, Richard, for this wonderful lecture, which also gave us a brilliant entree, a brilliant premiere for this RISM Lecture series. And I think for everybody who will come after you, you set up an extraordinary example of how to combine the study and talking about the study of manuscripts with personal and research insights. So this is exactly what we hoped to receive when we invited you, and the discussion showed that you brilliantly fulfilled this task. So thank you again, and thank you to all of you for your interest, for your participation, for your questions, and well, for your friendship with RISM. Thank you so much. So this was my official last words. If you would like to continue to speak about aspects of papal manuscripts, we are here, and we could do.
I just might add that Lewis Lockwood does not like the word positivism, especially as applied to him. He told me that.
Yeah. Joshua, please.
He's muted. There he goes.
Now I'm not, finally. Yeah, as picking up from that, the first time, well, everybody who went to Princeton knew the word positivism, but indeed it didn't mean anything like what Joe Kerman said it meant. We all associated it with positivistic philosophy, logical positivism, the great priest of which at Princeton was Milton Babbitt, of course. And I remember the first time hearing the word positivistic, the adjectival form, applied to this research by Herbert Kellman, whom I met in 1969, I think also out at Urbana when I was out on some record company business. And Herbert was kind enough to invite me over for lunch and just then spend a long afternoon talking with me. And he spoke there of this new kind of positivistic work on the manuscripts. So it was around somehow, but there's no question that it took on a very different meaning when Joe Kerman entered the picture.
Indeed.
Yes, there was also a question, well, at the beginning, which went a bit to this direction. I don't know if the person who raised it is still there. And the question was, while it seems that the interest in the culture of the papal choir was not totally forgotten, in what ways did earlier positivistic research activities hinder or enable your cultural interpretation? Richard.
I can't answer that. not on the spur of the moment.
Okay. So, but Peter has raised his hand.
I have one reaction that perhaps others have too, and that is how amazingly short that time at Princeton was. It was just 2 or 3 years before I was there as an undergraduate, and I was more consumed by playing soccer and singing in arches than paying attention to what was going on in the music department. But nevertheless, I think Tom Hall also came out of this soup of scholars, and I pretty much adopted some of his work after much of it was lost in a car in Europe. I understand his car was stolen, plus all of his manuscript information. That eventually turned into my dissertation through Larry Arp, as a matter of fact. But what an amazing time period at Princeton to realize 69, 70, 71, all of that was going on while I was just entering as a freshman.
I should have referred to Tom Hall, who actually helped me. He actually also looked at some of those manuscripts. He happened to be in Italy at some point, and he looked and sent me stuff. I still have the stuff that he sent to me about that, but then he sort of left the business. And that was the end of that.
I understand that the loss of the car was the end of his aspiration.
Oh, yeah, I could imagine.
Yes, okay. So I can't see any more raised hands. So I would say let's come to an end, and thanks again so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Klaus.
And yes, I'm really happy that we had such a wonderful premiere, and yes, we hope to continue like this. So indeed, thank you also to you, Thomas, for your introduction. Thank you to Dr. Montuschi for her welcome, which was really gave us a very, very good overview over the other collections which are still to be inserted in the RISM catalog. So that remains a lot of work to do. And yes, and last but not least, of course, to Balázs and to the whole RISM team, especially also for Jennifer tonight, Jennifer Ward, who organized the whole this wonderful Zoom conference, which was really not an easy task with so many participants. But also all the other members of the team. So thanks a lot, and yes, stay healthy, and hope to see you again at the next RISM lecture. We have some ideas how to go on, but nothing concrete for the moment. But we will, of course, let you know.
Thank you, Klaus. I mean, without you, none of this would have happened. Yes, certainly not the catalog. Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
What do we do now? We all leave now? Is that what we do?
Yes. we don't have the bar open, or the place where we could go and have a cup of wine or beer.
And we still have, I mean, imagine if this were actually in Rome, if we could sort of go somewhere nice. And,
yes, or to the Vatican bar. This would be.
Right. I don't think we would all fit into the Vatican.
Oh, yeah. But there will be better times, and we will try to come together in reality, or in Rome, or in Frankfurt, or in Mainz, wherever. We will find possibilities.
Very good.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.